people. Does anyone need, thanks, Chad. Does anyone need the typeface larger or would recommend larger typeface? Looks good. All right. Last time we read 185, and it is our tradition that we review the section that we left off with the last time, so I'll read 185 right now. And the next day I went to a Baptist's house, and the officers and justices and magistrates of the town were gathered together at the hall. And they granted a warrant for me and sent for me, and I was up to the town hall to them where a many was gathered. And many rude people there were that had sworn strange things against me. And a great deal of discourse I had with them, and showed them the fruits of their priests' preaching, and how void they were of Christianity. Though such great professors, but without profession, for they were independents and Presbyterians. And one swear one thing, and one swear another thing against me. They asked me if I were the Son of God. I said, yes. They asked me if I had seen God's face. I said, yes. They asked me whether I had the spirit of discerning. I said, yes. I discern him that spoke to me. They asked me whether the scripture was the word of God. I said, God was the word, and the scriptures were writings, and the word was before writings were, which word did fulfill them. And so, after a long examination, they sent me to prison as a blasphemer, a heretic, and a seducer, though they could not justly charge any such thing against me. And the two jailers were like bear herds. And when the head jailer had me up into a great chamber and told me I should have what I would in that room, I told him he should not expect any money from me, and that I would not lie in none of his beds nor eat none of his victuals. And so I sat up all night. And then he put me into another room where I got a thing to lie on after a while. And this yellow box is something I couldn't get rid of when I was marking up the chapter. Let's hear from David. David Fink, did I see your hand up?
Yes, I was toggling it. It went on and off. If it's still appropriate to comment on things from last time, I would note a distinction that frequently appears in Fox's writings, and the words have changed a little bit. The difference between professing and possessing. What he calls the great professors, it doesn't have to do with those who wear academic robes and teach classes in universities, but it means those who will claim or preach a particular doctrine. But he's contrasting it to those who possess the truth in their own heart and experience. It's the difference between talking and doing, I mean, and testifying. Professors can be quoting what they consider to be authorities, but a much greater authority in Fox's teaching here is those who possess what the Holy Spirit is giving to them. The other is I'm noting, and I can't recall if we had talked about this before, that he simply refuses to give a bribe. And my guess is that jailers probably had a fairly hefty income from those who wanted more than a, straw pallet or a some rude piece of cloth on the dungeon floor. When it said he had him up into a great chamber and you can have whatever he wanted, I'm sure that was for a price. And Fox saw right through that. Don't expect any money from me. One more indication of what we would call a testimony of integrity.
Thank you, David. And let's hear from Bev.
I just wanted to comment that this one paragraph, I said God was the Word and the scriptures were writings, and the Word was before writings were, which word did fulfill them, is so powerful for me. I don't fully understand it, but I know it goes to thoughts or feelings I had even from childhood. And it's very inspiring.
Are we ready to move on to the next section? Any further comments? Sorry, Chad, you had your hand up?
People have mentioned in the past how easily it might be to judge these people for what they're doing. But for some of them, they've been born and raised in a certain way of doing religion and thinking that, and been taught all their lives, this is the way that God does things. And so when the Quakers come with a different kind of message and a different way of doing it, and I can see how they're upset. Just like first century when Jesus came and was preaching a different message than the religious factions of that day. And there were religious factions. The fruit of it was that they wanted to kill him all the time. They wanted to persecute him, even though he was speaking God's truth, I believe. This is Fox's. And the fruit of the Spirit is peaceableness. It's not factions. Factions is a fruit of the flesh. And you can see people that were, when we're taught by man, it's not the same thing as when we receive something from God. Because God produces in us his righteousness and his love and his peaceableness, even for people who are different. But the fruit of religion think he says here the fruit of, maybe it's in the next passage where he says the fruit of your preachers is this, that you want to persecute you, Fox. And they want to throw him in jail, even though in the extra notes I have the Blasphemy Act, so you can compare the items on this list with what Fox's answers are, and none of them violate the act of blasphemy. So they're actually imprisoning him unjustly by their own law, just because they feel he's blasphemous, right? And he's preaching something different. So we need to shut this guy up. And that's their only power, is this worldly power, which they depend on to enforce and coerce conformity. There's none of the Spirit's respect for the diversity that God brings amongst people. It's all about forced conformity. And that's what they've been taught is right. So they've been taught that it's right to persecute people who are different and force them into conformity with what they think is God's will or way. And I so appreciate the early Friends and Quakers, that they were moved by that Spirit of God that takes away all the occasions of wars and warring, even internally. Not only about weapons and killing each other, which is big and huge, because in these times and close to these times, like all the so-called Christian reformers, all of them approved the killing of other people because they didn't believe the right way. Even though their own beliefs were in flux and changing and evolving, that other reformer over there that doesn't believe exactly like I do deserves death. I don't think the Spirit of God produces that in people. My opinion, you're allowed to have your own opinions. You don't have to agree with me. And so that's why I appreciate the early Friends, that they were not in the persecuting business. They spoke their truth plainly, simply, roughly sometimes. But they weren't into persecuting people. But they made this sharp differentiation between people who possessed and lived by the Spirit and those who only live by a rote religion that they've been taught by man, which produces a much different fruit. So dogma and doctrine and indoctrination does not produce the fruit of the Spirit. But when God speaks to us and reveals something in us, it brings all the attributes of God with it. His kindness, his goodness, his compassion, his gentleness, his love. When we encounter God, his righteousness, when we encounter God, we are transformed, we are upgraded into something closer to God than where we were before we encountered him. And he's infinite in all these attributes at the same time. So just like putting your finger in a wall socket with a lot of power in it, it has an effect. Whereas the effect of conforming to a religious idea that's taught by man and the Spirit doesn't infuse produces quite opposite fruit. Elise, did you have something you wanted to share? Sorry for interrupting.
Thank you. My question was answered. I was trying to find my place because my pages are different from the page being shown. So I'm good. Thank you.
Shall we move on to the next section? Nod your head if you are in agreement. Very good. Excellent. I'm seeing most people agreeing to that. Ginny, I wonder if I could call on you to read this next section.
Certainly. And the assizes came on, and all the news and cry in the country was that I was to be hanged. And the high sheriff said, one, Sir Wilfrid Lawson, that he would guard me to my execution, and stirred them much up to take away my life. They were all in a black, dark rage, and they set 3 musketeers upon me, one at my chamber door, another at the stairs foot, and another at the street doors, and would let none come at me except one to bring me some necessary things. And at nights they would let up priests. About 10 o'clock at night, they would bring in droves of them, and exceeding rude and devilish they were, when they could get no hold of my words. For the truth did not convince them, and was like a fire upon their heads and in their hearts. But the Lord in his power gave me dominion over them all, and I let them see both their fruits and their spirits. And there came most of the gentry of the country to dispute. And great ladies and countesses came to see a man that they said was to die. And the priest would temptingly ask, what? Must I die for their sins? Which manifested that they were in the nature of them that crucified him that died for the sins of the world. And there was a company of bitter Scottish priests and Presbyterians, made up of envy and malice, who were not fit to speak of the things of God. They were so foul-mouthed. Many priests that came to me would be asking questions and saying the scriptures were the word. And I asked them how many gods there were, and they said, 1. I asked them whether God was not the word, and they would say, yes. And so I let them see how they did confound themselves, for there was not a prisoner but was able to confute them. And so, when they were contriving, both judge, sheriff, and justices, of putting me to death, the judge's clerk started a question to them that confounded them all, after which they had not power to call me out before the judges.
Thank you. The next little sentence introduces the next section, so that's where you ended off just where I intended. It's sometimes hard to put the markings very clearly, but thank you, Jenny, for that reading. Let's hear from Bev.
I'm having a very difficult time understanding what he did in discussion or in being with these people. And when he says, near the end, and so I let them see how they did confound themselves. I don't understand how he did that. And for there was not a prisoner, but was able to confute them. Does he mean other prisoners participated in this? It's like I really want to know what he said, what he received to deal with them. And I just wanted to add, just before the meeting, I was looking at another article for a different reason, and there was a sidebar on Scottish witches. And in Scotland now, this group is asking for, there were more witches killed in Scotland than any other European or British area. And they're asking that their sentences be, well, I'm having word retrieval problems, that those sentences be done, and that those women, mainly women that were killed as witches, that they be exonerated. So I really get this sense of how disturbed these people were by someone daring to speak against their belief system.
Thank you, Bev. And let's hear from David Fink.
Well, Bev, I am also very curious to know what the actual exchange was, who was saying what, both what the judge's clerk had asked, and what were the things coming from the rest of the prisoners. Seems to me that Fox has real agility in terms of logical consistency and points out when people are contradicting themselves, or saying things that just don't make sense. And even though he doesn't believe that worldly knowledge and the kind of study of Aristotelian logic is what's going to make a difference in the goodness of your life, he still does know how to let people's own words confound them, I guess we would say. So he gives us a good bit of information, but of course we're still curious to know what the actual dialogue would be. I would also add that I've seen several instances recently of where people have been posthumously pardoned. Bayard Rustin, a Quaker organizer for Martin Luther King and a number of other ventures, his conviction has been, which was in the early 1950s in California, I think, has been set aside. He's also been given a Presidential Medal of Honor. So I'm glad to know that there is some activity afoot to try to undo those persecutions of the past. The only people who were ever officially put to death for being Quakers, rather than dying in prison, were the 4 martyrs in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And one way that the people of Massachusetts did penance for that, I don't know that it was legal exoneration, but they put up a statue of Mary Dyer, our Quaker martyr, right in front of the State House on Beacon Hill in Boston. So I'm glad you bring to our attention that there is some effort to undo those terrible persecutions of the past.
Thank you, David. And let's hear from Barb.
Thanks. I have a different version of the journal. And it says in the notes, as in Derby, the charge is blasphemy under the Act of 1648. The report, spoken of later, that he would be put to death was not mere rumor, for it was a real possibility under this act. Wow. I guess that's why everybody and their mother came out to cross-examine him, and yet he was up for the task. I mean, first of all, this guy sort of had superhuman stamina, George Fox, and he reminds me of the Apostle Paul in a lot of this, but he's so unafraid of confronting and being confronted. He has an answer for everything, and they don't seem to be able to catch him in their nets, their verbal nets, even though they want to do away with him, because he's sort of pointing out where they fall short. It also strikes me that, I mean, here in the US, church and state aren't so tightly entwined as it was back in this day, where the state just kind of like, the state could put you to death for violating religious, for blasphemy. So it's just amazing that he confronted. It wasn't unbelievers that he was confronting believers. So it's I guess everything was in turmoil in England at that time, but this is just a mind blower in that I'm going to have to watch my tongue about comments I make about other denominations and stuff, because I don't want to, just have to walk more lightly instead of, that's it.
Thank you, Barb. And let's hear from Elise.
A couple of things. On the previous page, when they ask you about scripture and the word of God, he says, God was the word. The scriptures were writings, and the word was before writings were, which word did fulfill them. And in the following page, when he's talking to the people who are questioning him, they agree that God is the word. And what, to me, what enables him to do and say what he does is that he feels himself immersed in the Lord. We're in the middle of the page. I guess it's 160 that everybody has. The Lord in his power gave me dominion over them all. So I think that God speaks through him, and I don't find it helpful to think of him as personally clever, but that he is open to be used, and he is powerfully used by God, because he has had that experience of Christ come to teach his people himself. And that experience is what he lives in. that's where he's coming from all the time. And so he doesn't need to be afraid, not because everything will always go his way, but because he knows that he is within this powers in him, that he is following God as he's being led, and he doesn't have to worry what the outcome is, whatever it might be.
Personally, I'm reminded about Jesus and the different sects came to him, sects, denominations of that time came to test him with questions. But Jesus, being moved by the power, and testified that he said nothing except what the Father gave him to say, and did nothing except what the Father moved him and showed him to do, had wisdom from God to refute them. So much so that they were afraid to ask him any more questions. And he didn't even answer their questions sometimes. Sometimes he replied with a question. That confuted them. And he says here that the truth convinces them. So I think it's a capital T truth in this case, where it's God who convinces them. And the word convincing in that time also meant convicting them of the truth, convicting them of their own hearts in their pursuit of persecuting him. And you notice it's all the priests and the gentry and the people that are considered high and mighty and knowledgeable that come. And I think he says any prisoner would be able to confute them. So all their high-mindedness, as he uses the term quite often, all their thinkings and their doctrines and their thinking that they are great and wise is nothing compared to God's wisdom. And I've been in that situation where Fox's continual advice to friends is to stay low in the spirit and only move or speak outwardly when the spirit moves you and by the spirit's wisdom and power. And so sometimes even in the journal, you'll see he waits. Sometimes he waits a long time. It could be hours before he has what the spirit wants him to speak. And he'll wait for however long it takes, because he's not moving in his own power and wisdom, but in Christ. And so Paul put it this way: I strove to know nothing except the crucified Christ and what he gives me to say, so that your trust would not be in human wisdom, but in the power of God. And so we can say all we want outwardly. It could be very truth. It could even come from God. But what is required is that the truth within them would witness to the truth. That they would be convinced by that Spirit of God and become followers of that Spirit of God within them, and not become followers of Fox or Quakers or this denomination or that. Because the power and the transformation and the goodness of God comes from hearing God, from experiencing him, from feasting on him and following him, and not from following what we might think is right or truth or goodness, or even striving in our own power to produce our own goodness. That's not where the infinite goodness of God is produced. And once you see the infinite goodness of God pouring through your being, you don't want to see your goodness anymore that you can produce in your own strength. You want to see that infinite goodness that's infinitely pure and kind and loving. You don't want to see your own righteousness anymore, so-called, your own dirty rags. You want to see his infinite goodness. And you want to move in it, and you want to live in it. And the more you do, even Jesus says, you will see troubles. What the teacher endured, you will endure too, the more that you walk in his way. And so it wasn't the so-called sinners that wanted Jesus dead. It was the religious people of his time. Just like with Fox. It's the religious people that were the worst in wanting to have him persecuted and killed. That were full of envy and malice, were making up lies about him and what he said, wanted to persecute him and beat him and kill him. And we're so motivated to do so. And it seems the greater the light rises up against the darkness responds and wants to rise up and put out and extinguish that light. And there has to be a real conversion, a change of foundation in the person before they can come from darkness to light. And that is available and possible for every human being. I muted you at least by mistake, so make sure you can unmute yourself and then mute yourself again. Thank you. Bev, please unmute.
This is my second time, so I hope that's okay. If there's someone else that wants to speak, I can wait. Okay. I guess my curiosity in knowing what he said, I realize comes, nowadays, anyone that speaks, and from that deeper place, it can get recorded. I can hear it. And it's like this great loss in not hearing his actual words. But the part in here where he says, if I can find it now, sorry. For the truth did convince them and was like a fire upon their heads and in their hearts. And I don't understand it, but I know it's very deep. This fire on their heads is like, for me, I want to understand things at a cognitive level, but that's not where true understanding exists. It's in the heart. It's like the Aramaic. There's a word for the heart, but there's no word for the mind. Thoughts are on the surface of the heart. And it's like when the words come from that deeper place, it's like a way of getting out of your head and onto your heart to hear the truth. I think it's very powerful for me. And it's just being able to discern or decipher when those words are coming either from another person or from within myself. And it's a great gift.
Go ahead, Ruth.
Yes, seems to be like a threshing going on where the prisoners are being convinced. And the clerk, the judge's clerk, seems to be convinced as well. And even the people that are against him are having changes happening, but they're not ready to, they're not right. Because they've got a lot to lose. The people who are not being convinced have a lot materially to lose, but the others have less to lose and seem to be almost God's rear guard or something. Like, I don't know, you know, if in this scene it seems to be that he's got like a company of angels in the prisoners and the clerk, and that he's it must be encouraging. I would find it encouraging to find that there are people who are on his side. Although it doesn't sound like anything would stop him, but just I'm glad, I feel gladdened that there are others there who are supporting him.
Are we ready to move on to the next section? I see a few heads nodding. And before we do, I'd like to welcome David Nagel. David, nice to see you here. And we'll ask for a little bit of an introduction toward the end of the session, just not to interrupt our process so far. Thanks for being with us. And I'm wondering if I could ask Lynn Robinson if you would read this next section once it comes into focus.
Thank you, Donna. Yes, I'll give it a try. Anthony Pearson, being then in Carlisle, and perceiving that they did not intend to bring me as was expected upon my trial, wrote a letter to the judges of assize and jail delivery for the northern parts sitting at Carlisle. I am moved to lay before you the condition of George Fox, whom the magistrates of this city have cast into prison for words that he is accused to have spoken, which they call blasphemy. He was sent to the jail till he should be delivered by due course of law, and it was expected he should have been proceeded against at this assize. To my knowledge, he utterly abhors and detests every particular, which by the act against blasphemous opinions is appointed to be punished. Though he be committed, judgment is not given against him, nor have his accusers been face to face to affirm before him what they have informed against him. Nor has he heard as to the particulars of their accusations, nor doth it appear that any word they charge against him is within the act. Indeed, I could not yet so much as see the information, no, not in court, though I desired it. That his friends may not speak with him, I know no law nor reason for. I do therefore claim for him a due and lawful hearing, and that he may have a copy of his charge, and frees him to answer for himself. And that rather before you than to be left to the rulers of this town, who are not competent judges of blasphemy. Anthony Pearson. But notwithstanding this letter, the judges were resolved not to suffer me to be brought before them, but reviling and scoffing at me behind my back, left me to the magistrates of the town, giving them what encouragement they could to exercise their cruelty upon me. Whereupon, though I had been kept up so close to the jailer's house that friends were not suffered to visit me, and Justice Benson and Justice Pearson were denied to see me, the next day, after the judges were gone out of town, an order was sent to the jailer that I should be put in the dungeon amongst the moss troopers. And so they did, where men and women were put together, and never a house of office, in a nasty and very uncivil manner, which was a shame to Christianity. And the prisoners were exceeding lousy. And there was one woman almost eaten to death with lice. But the prisoners were made, all of them, very loving to me. And some of them were convinced, as the publicans and harlots of old were, so that they were able to confound a priest that might come to the gates to dispute. And Justice Benson's wife was moved of the Lord to come and visit me, and to eat no meat but what she ate with me at the bars of the dungeon window. A good, honest woman, who after was imprisoned herself at York for speaking to a priest when she was great with child and had a child in prison. She continued a good friend till she died.
Thank you, Lynn. And let's hear from David Fink.
Well, this does give us a sense of the horrible conditions that friends suffered in 17th century England. And I think I've seen the figure that somewhere around 500 Quakers died, not by officially being condemned to death, but just by these kind of conditions that we're getting some hint of. As much as I have seen and regret where the force of law and those who are entrusted with public service have been corrupted and misused, and people have unjustifiably suffered, yet I am impressed with what we may call the Anglo-Saxon law tradition, the tradition of legal rights, and that there are people here who know what is and is not legal, and that ultimately there may be vindication if you live long enough, if you don't die in prison. This section kind of leaves us hanging about what will happen, you know, when the judges of assizes basically turn him over to the cruelty of the local magistrates. But we have seen before, and I think we'll see again, that those in the legal profession and with public office, and we hear about Judge Fell quite a bit, but there are others who will insist that he be treated rightly. Such simple things that we may take for granted, as being entitled to know what you're accused of, facing your accuser, being able to cross-examine those who have a suit against you or the prosecutors. All of these legal matters that we're going to just begin to see them over the next months here in the United States, when a former president and 18 accused co-conspirators are being brought to trial. The prosecution will be diligent to make sure that every single right accorded to a defendant is there, so that there would be no grounds for overturning this on appeal. So I'm glad that they document here which legal rights have been denied to him, as well as what unjustifiable abuse he's incurring. I would add that I was glad to have had occasion to work with federal defenders in Northern District of Illinois during the times that about 300 young men resisting the draft were being prosecuted. And only a dozen or so ever ended up going to jail, but it was because of the deliberate, unflappable persistence of those who were representing them to make sure that charges would be dropped if there were any mistakes at all made by the government.
Even puts in the chat, by 1680, 10,000 Quakers had been imprisoned in England, and 243 had died of torture and mistreatment in the king's jails. Only 183 Catholics had been executed during all of Elizabeth's reign. Barb?
Imagine having a baby in prison, lousy with lice, and surviving that. Yeah, this just kind of underscores that we're bearing one another in our misguidedness and in our guidedness is imperative. Even in a political discourse in our country where we're divided, it does no good. It does no good to hate each other.
Bev?
Not quite sure how. Through this reading today, the sense I have of George Fox is because he's living from this place of spirit, that his physical body, his emotions, his thoughts, all of that is like, I don't know how to explain. I'm really having a hard time explaining what I'm trying to say, but it's like the conditions around him are not primary, whereas when we're living in the world, we're not in touch with anything else. All these things, the exterior things that are happening to us, I'm talking about myself, all these exterior things affect my sense of safety, and my connectedness is gone. And am I going to be okay? I have pain, blah, 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 blah. But it seems the lesson that I am getting today is that when you're living in this deeper way, the body, the mind, the emotions are secondary, or you can observe them. I'm thinking in terms of mindfulness. And they don't have that deep effect on you. You're aware of it, but you're living in a deeper place where that's all secondary. And I think that's what all teachers like George Fox, like Yeshua, like others, I think that's the lesson that I get, is that regardless of what these exterior issues are that are caused by the difficulties within other humans and in ourselves, are secondary to being present. That's the best I can do with it.
Madeline?
Thank you. Thank you, Bev. This is really just a gloss on what you said, which is something I've been aware of recently, is living on two levels, this idea that we are in the world but not of it. And times when people will, like, I just heard that a friend's nephew died of suicide, and my human love is in great sympathy with her. And I hope this doesn't sound harsh, but there's another part of me that is just okay with it, because God is with that child, his child, and there really, in a way, is no need for grief. It's a very interesting place to try to live.
even in the chat, thinks that the total number of Quakers who died of their faith was over 500. There is such a number on display of the history of the Quakers at Liverpool Friends Meeting House. I think at one time Fox did direct there to be a book, I don't know if it's called the Book of Sufferings, which enumerated many of the things that the Quakers endured at the hands of the so-called Christian state. Man's inhumanity to man. Sometimes I think it knows no bounds, but it seems excessively vicious when it's done in the name of God and religion. And the fact is that none of what George spoke to or did actually violated the act of blasphemy, which is in our extra notes if people want to look at it. He's completely innocent of all the charges that are in the law, which were set mostly by Presbyterian influence and maybe some Puritan influence as well. So he's completely he's completely guiltless. It's just their ideas of what blasphemy is, that they're unfairly persecuting him illegally, and the things that they do to him and all the legal procedures that he friend Anthony Pearson enumerates. These are none of this is legal by their own laws. It's just that force within them that wants to persecute and kill and silence. In an earlier session, we had this question, okay, what is convincement? It's not really a word we use these days. And maybe if we haven't experienced it, we might know the full depth of it. But for me, it's when we come off of our own supply of righteousness and goodness and self-governance that come under God's. And that's when he says that even the prisoners that became convinced, they started receiving that of God within them and God's supply of righteousness and goodness and wisdom and truth. They could confute these visiting priests with all their knowledge and all their doctrine and all their education at certain colleges that were approved, religious colleges, because they came into the wisdom of God and the purity and the goodness and kindness. It's a different foundation than to live by your own wisdom and goodness. But it's very real. And their whole lives were transformed by it. This living by the Spirit. Lynn?
Thanks, Chad. I've just been reading a poem by from my poetry club by Giordano Bruno, he was an alchemist, but he was taken to the stake by the Catholics during the Inquisition. And one of his last statements was, I think they may be more afraid of me than I am of them. And I see these people harassing Fox as, perhaps one could say, crazed with fear or forced into the darker parts of their nature by fear that their group will disintegrate, something like that. And what they have to lean on in their lives won't be there. He's challenging their stability, which is pretty life and death in some ways. So I get to a very strange place here of, if they're so afraid, disputing is not going to reach them. Showing that they're illogical, which they are, is not going to reach them. Somehow, Fox, who is trying to convince people, must reach that place of fear in them and gentle it. And there are times when he preaches, when the power that moves through him does overwhelm those fears, absorbs them. It is stronger than those fears. And there are times when he does not reach them. And so my question is not how awful are these people, but how do you reach them? He doesn't always. It's an important question.
I think that Fox is just doing what he's told, and there may be some people that he's told to stay clear of. Like for example, before in Pickering, he was told not to go into the churches, but in Carlisle he went into the churches. So it's he's being directed to, and sometimes it's not him that's answering to them, but the prisoners. So I think he just does what he's been guided to do. It's not really he's not in control as such. He's letting God direct. For example, he stood on the cross in this particular place, but another place he stood on the haystack, or he went into the church, or in Lichfield he was very specifically directed to answer to the Roman carnage in the city of Lichfield. So I think unfortunately it seems that not everybody is to be convinced, not in Jesus's time and not in George Fox's time, but at the end I think there'll only be love left. But that's just me. I believe that in the end there's only the Alpha and the Omega, world without end, and the rest is just the ocean of darkness, and it's not there's nothing substantial in it. Ultimately it's beyond what we can understand. So
David Fink?
Lynn raises a challenging question of how do we reach them? And there have been times in my life that I am insecure, feeling insecure, uncertain, wondering if anything I say is getting through, if I'm either saying too much or too little. I've recently discovered or rediscovered very helpful words of admonition from Paul in his letters. His letter to the Christians in Philippi, what we call the 4th chapter, in which he advises, do not be anxious about anything. Instead, in every situation, through prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, tell your requests to God. And then goes on with what we may have heard or recited a lot. And the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. So I think we are called to faithfulness, to do our part in sowing the seed where we have that opportunity, and we know that some of it will fall on fertile soil and some on dry ground, and some will sprout and some never will. But that's not up to us. I think it's to be open to what is given to us in the particularity of that time and place. It's different than writing it out in advance. Just letting that truth flow through to us. No expectation that any particular person will be converted or convinced, but just knowing that we are part of that, that greater plan, a mystery that we just have a little glimmer of insight into.
I think it would be a bad thing if they were convinced by our wisdom instead of the wisdom of God. It's the wisdom of God that brings that transformation, that change of foundation, that upgrade. Jenny?
Yeah, I really like that question about why he was able to convince some and not others. And I think the parable of the seed certainly explains a lot of it. It's whether the ground is ripe, the heart is open. But the other thing is, I think back on the people that have really moved me. And it wasn't what they said, it was who they were. And certainly it helps that Fox was articulate and knew what he was talking about. He had the words. But I think the convincement came from who he was.
Bev?
I don't know if I had said it at the beginning, but I wanted to know what the practices were that George Fox did, because that's what I need to do. And I'm very thankful for what people have said in this reading, because it's like it's all coming through. It's like having my question answered, being led. And I know that's true in my life too, when Ruth, I think it was, said about he was led to be here or do this or say that. We have that in our lives too. When I have this pressure to call someone and find out how they are, it's a pressure that's either coming from within me or through me, and I respond to it. And I think that's what I'm supposed to do. And when I think about the things I've done in my life, and it's kind of happened, things happened to make it happen if I was open to it. And yeah, it's quite wonderful. I did put something in the chat, and I don't think there's any point in me. I don't think I need to read it, but I think that connects to very much to what Lynn was saying. And for me, it makes it I feel very hopeful now. I feel very good that I don't have to try and do anything. I just need to be present, and whatever comes, and to do what I can to heal my human self, my body, my mind, my emotions. And it's just the path to take. It feels quite wonderful and disturbing at the same time. And I'm very thankful to all of you.
We like to especially hear from the people who haven't shared very much and give them opportunity and space to share. We can hear their voice. If you haven't shared or you haven't shared much, please speak up. You don't have to, but you're invited. David Raymond?
Like, I guess I was thinking about why somebody would become a martyr, as George Fox is willing to do, and other Quakers were willing to do, other Christians and other people. Because I mean, I wouldn't, personally, I could never see myself laying down my life for, not for the religious communities I've been involved with, whether it's the Baptist church that I grew up in or any Quaker community that I've been a part of. I would never be able to say, oh, I'm going to lay down my life because I believe in what this community is telling me, or in some idea. Although I know some people can, some people have. I wouldn't be able to do that for an idea or for some intellectual concept or for the scriptures or something like that. But I just feel like, with George Fox and some Quakers, and just other people, that I feel like George Fox found something that was so full of joy, and he found truth and things that once you've found, would you really choose to walk away from that even for a moment? It's such a powerful thing, and you're spending so much time trying to open yourself to this, and then somebody says, okay, well, agree with us right here and tell us that you agree with us, and then we'll let you go. And I can see why somebody would say, well, no, I can't turn my back on this for a second, this joy that I found, So I feel, I kind of feel like, I don't know, to me, that kind of helps explain it a little bit of why, why he'd be willing to go so far as to be killed for what he believes in, because what he believes in fills him with so much joy. And so to walk away from that and to go back to a colorless world, I think that would have been too much. Same with the early Christians who were persecuted and killed. The story goes, they would test some of these Christians and say, well, it's fine that you believe in Jesus and in God, but you have to believe in the emperor first. And for a lot of Christians, they would say, well, no, I can't say that. And then they would be killed because they weren't able to show their loyalty in that way, I guess. And it's like, well, they're not doing that just because some preacher told them you have to believe in this and that. It's because they had a real experience of something that was so precious to them, that they weren't going to give that up, even though it meant their own death. They had already experienced something that's so far beyond that, I guess. I guess that's just something, a thought that I had. And then I also just think about, well, it's something that I always think about every Quaker meeting I go to, every I just can't help it but just to think about how Quakers are also persecutors. Quakers are colonizers. And and that's the uncomfortable truth. And it's, what Quakers took part in was much worse than any persecutions George Fox is going through here. And I just, I'm trying to hold that in my mind as well, and also just, in spite of all of these people trying to persecute George Fox, the truth still remains the same. And no matter what they do, they're not going to be able to change that truth. And so I just see, eventually it's going to break through. And somehow George Fox, his approach, I mean, I like that. That clerk kind of is the one to ask that question. It doesn't tell us what question he asked, but I thought that was interesting how, and it kind of reminds me of Jesus walking through the crowd where they're going to kill him and throw him off a cliff, but somehow he's just able to walk right through the crowd, kind of almost miraculously. But obviously there's anyways, those are just thoughts that I had while we were reading these passages.
Good thoughts. Thanks for sharing. Elise?
I'd just like to recommend to friends who would like to explore more thoroughly what was going on with George Fox and some of these early friends, and what was the power. It wasn't that they had found something wonderful. So the book is Douglas Wynn's Apocalypse of the Word. This was an experience that, here it is, the truth. This is the end of the way things used to be and the beginning of a new way. And it was astonishing. And it, in much the same way, I think, as the early followers of Jesus felt that. And then time goes on and a generation passes and it isn't what you thought. But when people had this experience, it's real that Christ has come now to teach his people himself. And it just has to be spread. It just turns everything upside down. That's the apocalypse part. And the word here in the apocalypse of the word is, of course, is God. But all of a sudden, everything has completely changed.
This week I was listening to a podcast, and the author of that was talking about the story of Jesus in the desert and being tested. And he said, if I remember this correctly, that story wasn't so much about, the point of that story wasn't so much about, isn't this wonderful, Jesus got through those trials, but the point was really that he learned how to exist when everything was taken away from him. And that was to rely on God. And much of what we've shared today has helped give me more insight to that. It's like we've said so often about Fox listening to God, God directing, waiting for that direction. So it's everything else has been stripped away, or we yearn for that time when everything has been stripped away and we can rely solely on God, on Christ's teaching.
If we think about it as a change in foundation, imagine if you had a house and you had to change the foundation. Everything would be turned over. But that gift of suffering and martyrdom, and I call it a gift because the Bible calls it a gift, it's an empowerment from God. It's not something that we would have in our own arsenal and own ability. At least I wouldn't have it normally anyway. But it is something of a calling that comes from God for certain people, not for everyone. I don't think everyone. And it's like the world is so messed up that it takes a willingness to suffer and die for righteousness' sake, for God's sake, in order to set it right. For someone to absorb all the hatred and fear and hurt that is out there that drives people and controls them. And somehow, maybe it's mysterious, I don't know, somehow it helps set the world right. I think about in this, speaking of David Fink here and about the civil rights movement, it's when it was shown on TV what was done against those protesters that it really hit home for people. And then there was an outcry. And then some change occurred in the world. They were willing to be mistreated for righteousness' sake, to set things right, and to give up their privilege, give up everything they have, to be beaten, to suffer, to die, to be jailed. And so I hold that they were moved by the Spirit of God too. Whether they consciously knew it or not, they knew what was right and what was wrong. And a friend this week said, "Oh, I'm going to write down the things I believe." I said, "I'm much more interested in the things that you know for true, know for sure that are true, that you'd actually die and stake your life on them. I'd rather read that list. You don't have to follow what I'd rather you do, but I'd be much more interested in that list of the things that you know, that you know, that you know, that this is truth and this is goodness and this is not." David, think?
Well, this is a, I hope, brief remark with my eye on the clock and knowing that we're somewhat past our usual time. The word martyr, I think, may be misunderstood, and people use it as a derogatory. Well, a person has a martyr complex, and so this is something abnormal, or not the way that reasonable people would live. But the Greek root of that is witness. A person who testifies in a trial is a martyr in the Greek. So people who have been persecuted or put to death, suffering for truth, they are not seeking to be, suffering. They're not seeking the suffering. They're seeking to bear witness to the truth, and knowing that there may.
David, somehow
David,
you got muted somehow.
Sorry, I bumped the wrong button.
Oh,
Just to know that people can stake their life on being faithful and hoping that they live to keep telling that story. But knowing that, as Jesus said, you killed the prophets of old. That's a risk we may have to take. And I've known people who took that risk. The people who went to Mississippi Summer Project in 1965, they all wrote out their wills and mailed them back home. 3 of them didn't make it, but everybody knew what the stakes were. That's it for now.
Bev?
I just wanted to say that through the discussion, what I wanted to say is that that these principles like suffering and transformation, it exists in all spiritual traditions, over all time, in all places. There's nothing new. And I think every human being not only has the capacity, but that's our purpose, is to come into the fullness of our presence here at this, in the moment that we're in. And for me, all these spiritual teachings and practices are not about what we know or believe. It's about who we are, just being. And it's just wonderful. It's very painful too, but it's just wonderful to feel that it's communal and it's individual and it's all connected. And this group is such a blessing. Thank you.
Maybe we could have a few moments of